Hello, how are you? My name is Diego Moldes. I am a Spanish writer. I am the author of 15 published books, one of which has been translated into English in the US by Stephen Capsuto, who is here with me. The book is called When Einstein Met Kafka, Jewish Contributions to the Modern World. I'm delighted to be here with all of you, and today we're going to talk about comics, including graphic novels.
The way we're doing this is Diego and I are each speaking our own language as we record this, and then we're going to dub him into English. One of the things that surprised me, I knew about the origins of a lot of the famous superheroes. Obviously, Stan Lee created more superheroes than anybody probably, but also the origins of Batman and Superman and all of those. But you talk in the book about a lot of contemporary writers of graphic novels and comics that I hadn't even known about. Did you already know about comics when you were researching this chapter?
Yes, well, I think it was right around the year 2002 when I started getting back into the habit of reading comics. And then later, when I worked at the Mundo comic shops at El Corte Inglés, which is a department store chain in Spain, and I was in charge of marketing for these comic book stores, I had to start immersing myself in the world of comics, which I had set aside since I was a kid. And it also coincided with my friendship over the last 20 years with a great friend, who I wrote my doctoral thesis on, not about his comics but about his films, and that is Alejandro Jodorowsky, the most important comic book writer in Europe, not just today, but over the last 40 or 50 years. And that brought me back to the world of comics and to the well-known fact that during the Nazi era, it was a group of young Jewish creators, mainly in New York, because most were children of European Jewish immigrants in New York, almost all of them Ashkenazic Jews, who created, as everyone knows, Superman and Batman and so on. And then later in the 1960s, Stan Lee created Spider-Man and many other superheroes. I talk about that in the book. But before discussing superheroes, I should point out that there's indeed another type of Jewish creator with a more deeply rooted Jewish consciousness in what we would call auteur comics, created both in the US and in Europe, especially in what we refer to as Franco-Belgian comics, comics in French, where Jews of the diaspora or of the various diasporas have made major contributions to the world of comics. I have encountered fans and even experts on comics and cartoons who did not know that behind those names, which were often pen names, there were people who had been Jewish children who grew up to be illustrators and writers. For instance, in the book I mention a very interesting case. The creator of Betty Boop and of the Popeye animated cartoons, Max Fleischer. He was the brother of Dave Fleischer, and together they created those studios that rivaled Walt Disney's, the Fleischer Studios. And one of them was the father of the great film director Richard Fleischer. But for example, there's also Harvey Kurtzman, who created Mad Magazine, the satire magazine, which is very well known among connoisseurs. And he worked with Al Feldstein, William Elder, and others. And then in the underground comic scene, I would highlight Robert Crumb, who lives in France and is not Jewish himself, though his wife Aline Goldsmith is. And he himself acknowledges that there is a Jewish influence in his work indirectly, thanks to his wife. It's a very curious thing that he himself talks about. And then the most recognized example, I'll give 3 examples to sum up this flood of names. One, of course, is Art Spiegelman.
Yes, of course. Right. And Art Spiegelman redefined what a comic is, right? He's the author of the Mouse comics, right?
Yes. Well, in fact, as you know, he received the Pulitzer Prize for literature, not for comics. And it's the only case I know of in history where an artist and writer, because he does both the script and the drawings, has done something like what Spiegelman did. He created Mouse and then created MetaMouse, where he explains the whole creative process behind Mouse, which then packs even more of a punch once you've read MetaMouse. You get a better understanding of how he creates that vision of the Nazis and the Jews in the Holocaust using animals and, well, the mice, right? You already know the story, but anyway, I won't spoil it. Still, I think in case someone hasn't read it, it's probably one of the 2 or 3 most important comics of the second half of the 20th century, without a doubt, not just in English, but in any language. Then there's another example, which incidentally is a book my kids have in their room with their children's books, which is Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak.
Who also was a theatrical scenery designer. He did a lot of different things.
Yes, the truth is he was practically a Renaissance man, very talented, and once again he was also a child of Jewish immigrants. His parents came from Poland. He was born in the US in 1928 after his parents emigrated, but he also has that Jewish background, which is very much there in his work. because Where the Wild Things Are is partly about accepting others. And it's about the fantasy of how sometimes when someone feels oppressed, especially a child, they use their imagination to escape from that oppression, from that tense situation they're experiencing. And there are plenty of other examples, as I said. Of course, in Europe, there's Jodorowsky. There's also René Goscinny, a name that many people don't know. If you say René Goscinny, the name doesn't ring a bell or anything. But when you say Asterix and Obelix, people go, oh, of course, Asterix and Obelix. Obviously, I know who Asterix and Obelix are. The drawings were by Albert Uderzo, a Frenchman whose family came from Italy. But Goscinny's parents were Jewish immigrants from Poland. And my Polish friends from the Jewish community here in Madrid tell me that his last name means hospitable. Asterix is, I think, the most translated comic in history. And we could also mention Lucky Luke, which is another very influential comic. Then there's George Wolinski from Charlie Hebdo magazine, who was unfortunately murdered in the 2015 terror attacks in Paris. And he was a very well-known creator in the French humor scene. And oh, that's right, before continuing with the Europeans, I put this book here, so I wouldn't forget.
Will Eisner.
From 1978, if I remember correctly, it's the Contract with God trilogy, Life on Dropsy Avenue. It's wonderful, and besides, it has very Jewish subject matter. Also, as far as I know, it was the first book marketed with the label graphic novel. Graphic novels had already existed, but they weren't called that before. And conceptually, it was a leap forward, just like Maus, which came later. This is from 1978, so it's almost 50 years old, and Alejandro Jodorowsky himself, who, as I said, is a close friend of mine, when we talked about comics, he told me that for him the benchmark was this one, A Contract with God by Will Eisner. He says it's a book as profound as any masterpiece of world literature. That's what Alejandro told me, and it's very honorable for someone to speak so highly of another comic creator's book. In this case, a creator who even has awards named after him in the US, as you know, a kind of Oscars or Grammys of the comic world, called the Will Eisner Awards. That alone is very significant. Well, there are many more examples. I don't know if you want to mention one that you like.
Well, I am kind of fascinated. I forget the author's name. The person who wrote the Rabbi's Cat series.
Yes, Juan Safar.
Yes, and that's also sort of it's one of the few that is very specifically Jewish.
And he's also Sephardic.
Well, and I love digging into my Sephardic roots, which is one of the reasons why I was fascinated. One of the things that strikes me that runs through a lot of these is that they are either stories of outsiders who don't quite fit into society. You know, Batman is very alienated. Superman is literally an illegal immigrant, right? He's from another planet. And there's a strong anti-fascist sentiment running through a lot of those 20th century comics. And also Mad Magazine is sort of very anti-establishment, challenging abuses of power and things like that. There's a lot of that running through this. Obviously, Maus deals with Spiegelman's family's experiences in the Holocaust. That outside viewpoint seems to run through a lot of this.
Yes, exactly. One example that comes to mind is Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created Superman. And then there's the example of Bob Kane, right? Whose real name was Robert Kahn, who created Batman. And those were at DC Comics, or Detective Comics, it was originally called. These are perhaps two characters where what you're describing, Stephen, is most evident, right? Why? Why did these young people create a hero who is a Superman, or in this case, another hero who has a second identity, which is Batman, who combines darkness and light, the bat and the human being, right? Obviously, I think two things are intersecting here. One is Greek mythology, that's inevitable. It's the union of the Greco-Roman, Greco-Latin world with the Jewish world, with the Talmud, with Hebrew mythology, and with certain ideas about humanity reaching for the divine, that is, of overcoming mortality through immortality. And let's recall that Superman is immortal. Now, we could perhaps draw inferences from this example. As you know, I am very into chronology and dates. Chronological order is, I think, the most logical way to look at things. In Greek, chronos means time and logos means knowledge. And it's very, very clear why these superheroes were created when they were. In 1938, I believe, right around those years, wasn't it? And although Green Lantern, also from DC Comics, dates from 1940, and although other superheroes came later, it all begins in a very significant period. regardless of the cover dates of the monthly issues. We're talking about the period after 1933 and before September 1939, which is when Germany invaded Poland. And it's relevant that these were Jews, specifically from the countries Hitler invaded, that is, children of immigrants who came over in the first wave of migration from the former Russian Empire and the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. It is not a coincidence. There was a clear intent to create a grand allegory of good versus evil, where there is a threat to society and there's someone who will save society from that evil, which at that time meant Nazism. It's very obvious. It's been studied extensively. I'm not saying anything new, but when the Spanish edition of this book was published by Galaxia Gutenberg in 2019, many people in Spain and in the Spanish-speaking world, in Mexico and other countries, did not know that the US comic industry arose from the Jewish diaspora, you know?
Yes, of course. This all calls to mind, especially talking about the creation of Superman. I don't know if you have read the novel The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, which is sort of a fictionalized version of that, where you have the very Americanized Jewish teenager and his cousin who just emigrated from Eastern Europe, and together they create this superhero, and it sort of echoes all of that history of the creation of superheroes in the 20th century.
It's a novel that was actually recommended to me by a friend named Moises, a Jewish friend who's the son of the author of the foreword to the Spanish edition of my book. We haven't mentioned it yet, but you wrote the foreword to the US edition, and the foreword to the Spanish edition is by my friend Esther Ben-Dahan Cohen, who runs the cultural department at the Centro Sefarad, which is a Jewish cultural center operated by the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union Affairs, and International Cooperation. She wrote the foreword, and Moises, who now lives in New York, was also who introduced me to this novel years ago. I think I read it about 15 years ago. I don't remember when it came out, or maybe even longer ago. I don't recall the year. But anyway, what matters is that I was fascinated by that novel, and above all by the imagination involved in recreating that world, which was so unfamiliar to me, the whole context, that magma in which a modern mythology, the mythology of comics, was forged.
And that now it's been turned into an opera.
I didn't know that. I'd like to, you know that my specialty, which we haven't mentioned yet, is cinema and literature. That is, adaptations of literary works, novels and plays, to film. And I've always thought that that novel needed to be made into a film. Maybe a movie with more of an East Coast vibe, right? More New York, less Hollywood, you know? And to recreate that world. Well, also, since we're short on time, I don't want to forget Stephen, because I mentioned it earlier, two comic book authors who have had a huge impact on me because I've also read a lot of their work. One of them, and I didn't even know he had a Jewish background till I was finishing the last part of the book, is Hugo Pratt. I don't know whether he's well known in the United States. Hugo Pratt was a legendary comic book writer in Italy, famous in Europe, including France and Spain. He created a character called Corto Maltese, which is very, very well known to fans of European comics. And I'm reading this here because it's quite interesting. His full name was Ugo Eugenio Pratt. He was born in 1927 and died in 1995. He was descended from British Sephardic Jews of Turkish ancestry. And it says, this very diasporic figure lived in Ethiopia, when it was Italian in Mussolini's day, and in Buenos Aires before moving back to Italy and establishing himself worldwide in the international comic book scene. It's strange because I always say we shouldn't say the diaspora, don't I, Stephen? I mean, you are part Sephardic and part Ashkenazic. We should say the diasporas, always in the plural, right? And we should even refer to Jewish cultures in the plural, not the singular. And Pratt is a really fascinating example, isn't he? The word Sephardic means of Iberian origin, either Spanish or Portuguese. But his personal and familial journey also included Britain, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, Ethiopia, which also had a Jewish community, and one of the oldest, by the way, and Argentina, which also has a very large community in Buenos Aires, the biggest in Latin America, and Italy. And also Corto Maltese is a traveler and a sailor, a great character. And then the other person, of course, that I wanted to recommend is Joan Sfar. By the way, one of his translators was Esther Ben-Dahan, who I mentioned before. She translated L'Ancien Temps, Le Roi n'Embrasse Pas, into Spanish. And Sfar also has a very interesting comic called Chagall, about the famous painter. Chagall is perhaps the painter with the most Jewish themes in his work, right? He's not the most famous. Perhaps Modigliani, who was Sephardic, is more widely known, but Chagall is possibly the most representative Jewish painter of the 20th century. And again, there's a comic about him. But as I was saying, have you read Jodorowsky?
No, I've seen one of his films, but I haven't read his comics yet. European comics are not generally very well known in the US. We know, obviously, the comics from English-speaking countries, and we know Japanese comics. But the European comics, I mean, I know Asterix only because when I was a child, we lived in France. So I knew Asterix from there. Lucky Luke that's French also, right? I've seen some of those. American Cowboy, but it's a French comic. I haven't seen those here. Asterix is here. Tintin is here. The Rabbi's Cat series, not the entire series, but part of it is available in English. So I'm going to try and track those down.
When we talk about European comics, even though the United Kingdom is Europe, we Europeans tend to exclude British creators such as, Alan Moore, for instance. Since they write in English, we see them as part of the so-called Anglosphere, which is the entire English language linguistic community. In other words, it doesn't matter if they're from the United States, Canada, Britain, South Africa, or Australia. And it's not really accurate because the British are also Europeans. But usually we're talking about comics in the French language, which are Franco-Belgian or sometimes Swiss as well, or Italian or Spanish comics, mainly. There are also comics in the Czech Republic, in Poland, and so on. But the ones I mentioned are the best-known traditions. I'm currently reading this book by William Egginton from Johns Hopkins University, which is about Jodorowsky's films. There are about 9 books about him. I also have another one here by a Canadian author that arrived recently. I've written a book about him myself, and it's interesting because, while reading Bill Egginton, I'm discovering Lacanian psychoanalytic elements in his films, interpreted through Jacques Lacan and other authors, aspects that I hadn't considered in such comprehensive terms before. I mention this because if anyone watching us in the US wants to explore Jodorowsky's comics, they'll see that there are much deeper connections than it seems between his films and his comics, including the quintessentially Jewish notion of characters driven by a prophetic purpose. You know that Jodorowsky wanted to adapt Frank Herbert's Dune as a film, which wound up being made instead by David Lynch, and then later, the Canadian Denis Villeneuve made 2 wonderful films based on Dune. But Jodorowsky set out to make Dune, and the seed was already there, which blossomed into more than 200 comics. I've already said he's been the most renowned and sought-after comic book writer in Europe since the 1980s. He originally collaborated with Moebius, who was probably the best comic book artist that France ever had. And Jodorowsky has 2 comics that have been translated into English, which I would recommend to everyone watching. One is called The Incal, which is the most translated comic in European history. I'm talking about modern auteur comics, not comic strips or humorous comic books, but what we would call graphic novels. And the other one, which I like even better and hope will one day be made into a TV series because it's very long, is called The Cast of the Meta Barons. These are 2 graphic novels. The English title is just The Meta Barons, without cast, just The Meta Barons. And it's a wonderful creation fusing Greek tragedy, biblical legends, that is, Jewish legends, and also Shakespearean tragedy. It's like a wonderful cosmic mixture. For anyone who likes science fiction, I would recommend that one. And yes, the Incal is better known, but for me, it's The Meta Barons, illustrated by an Argentine artist who settled in Sitges, Catalonia, and who passed away during COVID, named Jimenez. Jimenez is amazing. And of course, the Incal series, illustrated entirely by Moebius, was published by Humanoid Associé, and it's truly wonderful. So here we have once again a person, in this case Alejandro, who is a descendant of Ukrainian Jews who first arrived in Argentina and then in Chile. Although, as you know, he's French and has lived in France since 1953, almost his entire life, though he also lives in Mexico. And he's a good example of the Jewish diaspora and of, let's just say, a multifaceted artist.
And what can people do if they want to find out more about all this?
What I wanted to say about my book, which I didn't say when I started talking, is I want to thank you, Stephen, for the magnificent translation, and of course Mandel Villar Press, Robert Mandel and Irene Villar, who are the ones who made this translated edition possible. This publishing house, which is a non-profit, also contributes to ecology and the protection of the environment. This is important, and above all, for me it's an honor that they have published a book by a foreign author, because I know that's not so common in the United States. Yes, fiction gets translated, especially novels, but to translate such extensive essays on a subject about which books have already been published in the US is something to be grateful for. And I think it was above all really vital to bring a Spanish and European researcher's voice into American homes and help show that, even if the public doesn't realize it, Jewish culture has contributed far more than we tend to think to many of the so-called, I don't like the term, but anyway, the so-called cultural industries, an expression that comes from the Frankfurt School. In the US, you tend to say entertainment, right? The entertainment industry, but the cultural industries. Here, it's comics. That's what we're discussing, but it could be many other media, film, music, and so on. And I just hope that everyone who's been listening to us has found it interesting.